Okay, so you want to own a football club, not a franchise with a fixed number of competitors and a closed league nobody can be relegated out of. Not a business where your worst season just means fewer playoff tickets sold. A football club, the kind with promotion, relegation, a 100-year-old badge, and supporters who inherited the club from their grandfather the way other families inherit furniture. You're picturing the director's box. 60,000 people on their feet. Your name in the matchday program under chairman. The biggest, most emotionally invested customer base in the history of business. People who will forgive you almost anything except relegation. Here's the number that should change that picture before you sign anything. £812 million. That's how much pre-tax losses grew in a single season across England's Premier League, the richest domestic league on the planet, broadcast into more living rooms than almost any other product in sport. Not the total loss, the increase in the loss. One level down, the number gets worse in a different way. £355 million. That's how much England's championship, the second tier, not even the Premier League, lost before tax in that same season, 2024-25. Not revenue, not spending, losses. And one level below that, the number stops being a headline and becomes a permanent condition. League Two clubs, the bottom rung of professional English football, lose an average of £2.2 million a year each, every single year, with no end in sight and no Champions League windfall coming to bail anyone out. Top to bottom, hundreds of millions in growing losses at the elite level, hundreds of millions in outright losses one tier down, and a quiet, structural, multi-million-pound shortfall at the very base of the pyramid that clubs simply learn to live with. Different scale, same direction, every single tier. Now go to the very top of the pyramid, where the money is supposedly real. In the 2024-25 season, Real Madrid became the first football club in history to cross €1 billion in revenue in a single year. The top 20 highest-earning clubs in the world combined for €12.4 billion, an 11% jump year-over-year. And most of those same clubs, at every level from the elite down to the provinces, are still not reliably profitable doing the actual business of football. That's the paradox this episode is built on. Not football clubs are bad businesses. Some of them generate more brand value and cultural reach than entire consumer goods companies. The paradox is narrower and stranger than that. An industry can post record, ever-growing revenue at the very same time that most of its participants are structurally unable to turn a profit from playing the sport itself. So if the football itself doesn't reliably make money, why do billionaires, sovereign wealth funds, and private equity firms keep lining up to buy clubs that lose it? That's the real question. Not should you buy a football club. It's, what are you actually buying if it isn't profit? Picture two images side by side. A stadium, sold out, 60,000 voices singing. And underneath it, in the boardroom, a ledger with a hole in it that somebody, somewhere, has to fill every single year. Keep that image. We're coming back to it. And as we're about to see, answering that question means dealing with an illusion first. The illusion of who actually owns a football club. Not long ago, the answer to that question really was simple. A local businessman, a family, sometimes a supporter's trust, people whose fortunes rose and fell with the clubs, because they rarely had anywhere else for the money to come from. That model built most of the clubs whose badges you recognize today. It is not the model running most of them now. The illusion is that a club has an owner the way a corner shop has an owner, one person, deciding, benefiting, absorbing the risk. That model still technically exists. At the level this episode cares about, it's almost extinct. What actually owns most of the world's biggest clubs now falls into three categories, and none of them think about football the way a fan does. The first is sovereign wealth. In October 2021, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, completed the purchase of an 80% stake in Newcastle United, paying roughly £305 million, with the remaining 20% split between a private equity firm and the deal's broker. By mid-2024, PEF had increased its holding to 85%. By July 2024, reports valued the club at more than £1 billion. For a fund managing something close to $1 trillion, Newcastle United isn't really a football investment. It's a rounding error with excellent PR. The second category is the leveraged financial buyer, private capital using the club's own future earnings to pay for the club. The textbook case is Manchester United. In 2005, the Glazer family completed a leveraged buyout valued around £790 million, and, critically, a debt-free football club that had never owed a meaningful sum to anyone suddenly carried roughly £525 to £600 million of acquisition debt, secured directly against the business itself. That debt would later peak near £778 million in 2010. The club didn't take out that loan to build anything. It took out that loan so its new owners could buy it. The third category is the multi-club network, ownership groups that don't buy one club, they buy a portfolio. City Football Group, built around Manchester City, holds stakes across 10-plus clubs on 5 continents. The logic isn't sentimental. It's the same logic as a venture capital fund. Spread the risk, share the scouting network, recycle players between markets, and let a handful of winners subsidize a longer tail of clubs that may never turn a profit on their own. None of these 3 ownership models is optimizing for make money selling football. A sovereign fund is optimizing for global visibility and diplomatic reach. A leveraged buyer is optimizing for the spread between what they borrowed and what the asset is worth on exit. A multi-club network is optimizing for the portfolio, not any single line on any single club's income statement. Which means the honest answer to who owns this club is rarely someone who wants to run a football club. It's usually someone for whom the football club is a vehicle for something else, and the football happens to be the product wrapped around it. Keep that distinction in your head. It's the key to almost everything that follows. The difference between an owner whose survival depends on the club's cash flow and an owner for whom the club is one line in a much bigger portfolio. Here's why that distinction matters more than it used to. For decades, the assumption baked into football finance was simple. A club that loses money eventually gets sold, restructured, or relegated into shape by the market, the same way any ordinary company would be. That assumption only holds if the owner needs the club itself to work financially. Once the owner doesn't, once the real return sits somewhere else entirely, in diplomatic reach, in tax-efficient asset appreciation, or in a portfolio spread across 10 other clubs, the normal discipline that forces a business to become profitable simply stops applying. The club can lose money indefinitely, as long as whatever sits behind it can keep absorbing the loss. That single fact is the reason a sport can post record aggregate revenue and record aggregate losses in the same season, without contradiction. It isn't one business failing to find profitability. It's several different kinds of capital, each with a different reason for being there. None of them under pressure to fix the P&L. So say you still want in. Here's the sequence of costs, in the order they actually hit you. First, the purchase price itself, and it's rarely just cash. It's usually leverage. The Glazer purchase of Manchester United, around £790 million, of which the family's own equity was closer to £520 million, with the rest borrowed against the club. Newcastle's 2021 deal looks smaller on paper, around £305 million for 80%, but that number undersells the real barrier, because before a single pound changes hands, a buyer has to pass something else entirely. Second, the ownership test. The Premier League's owners and directors test. UEFA's club licensing system. These aren't formalities. The Newcastle deal itself sat in an 18-month deadlock, first proposed in April 2020 and not completed until October 2021, specifically because the Premier League needed legally binding assurances that a foreign state would not control the club through its sovereign fund. Passing that test is now a real, multi-year cost of entry for any buyer with state or opaque financial backing. Third, and this one is expensive every single year, not just once, the squad cost ceiling. Since the 2022-23 overhaul of UEFA's financial rules, clubs in European competition are limited in what they can spend on wages, transfer amortization, and agent fees combined, as a share of revenue. 70%. That's the number UEFA has settled on as the permanent ceiling, phased in from 90% in 2023-24 to 80% in 2024-25 to 70% from 2025-26 onward. Below that number, you're compliant. Above it, you're in breach. And in July 2025, UEFA proved it means it, sanctioning 12 clubs including Chelsea and Barcelona for exceeding these thresholds. Chelsea alone was fined €20 million for breaching the separate football earnings rule, plus another €11 million for breaching the squad cost rule, €31 million in immediate penalties, with the threat of penalties beyond €80 million if the club failed to hit its improvement targets. And the 70% figure isn't even the whole story, because the ceiling isn't the same everywhere. From the 2026-27 season, the Premier League is scrapping its old loss-based domestic rule entirely in favor of its own squad cost system, but it set its own domestic ceiling at 85% of football revenue, a full 15 percentage points looser than UEFA's rule for clubs actually playing in Europe, which means a club that stays out of European competition can spend more relative to its revenue than a club that qualifies for the Champions League, a strange incentive built directly into the regulation itself, and a reminder that even the rules meant to control spending are negotiated tier by tier, league by league. It's worth pausing here to notice how different this is from the model most American sports fans grew up with. The NFL and the NBA run hard salary caps, tied to actual league revenue, with real enforcement and real revenue sharing between rich and poor franchises, a system explicitly designed to prevent the gap between big markets and small markets from turning into a permanent financial hierarchy. European football has no such floor, no meaningful revenue sharing between a Real Madrid and a mid-table club in the same country, and, because of promotion and relegation, no guaranteed membership in the wealthy tier from one year to the next. UEFA's squad cost ratio caps spending as a percentage of a club's own revenue, not the league's combined revenue. So a club with 10 times the revenue of a rival can still spend 10 times more on wages and stay perfectly compliant. The cap controls the ratio inside each club. It does nothing to control the gap between clubs. Fourth, debt service, and this one compounds quietly in the background for years. Manchester United's acquisition debt didn't just sit there. It accrued interest, some of it through a high-interest payment-in-kind loan structure, pushing total debt past $1.17 billion at one point, even as the club refinanced repeatedly. A 2013 refinancing of £178 million in outstanding debt was specifically designed to save the club roughly £10 million a year in interest, which tells you how much interest was being paid before that refinancing. Fifth, extraction. Once an owner has bought the club and structured the debt, some models add a final layer. Cash taken out of the business as dividends, on top of everything else the revenue has to cover. By 2019, the Glazer family had taken more than £90 million in dividends out of Manchester United across 4 years, separate from debt repayment, separate from transfer spending, separate from wages. Line them up and you get the real entry sequence. Purchase leverage, then regulatory approval, then an annual spending ceiling enforced with 8-figure fines, then compounding debt interest, and, for some ownership models, dividends extracted on top of all of it. Each layer is a twist most fans never see, because from the stands, all of it is invisible. What you see is a badge, a kit sponsor, and 11 players. What's actually happening is a leveraged financial structure wearing a football shirt. And notice something about that list. Almost none of those costs are actually about football. They're about financing, regulation, and compliance. The club's football department, the wages, the transfers, is the one-line item capped by an external regulator at 70%. Everything else on that list is a private matter between the owner and their bankers. So where does the real money move, if not from ticket sales? Start with the honest scale of the industry. Across the world's top 20 clubs, broadcast rights generated roughly €4.20 to €4.30 billion in a recent season. Commercial revenue, sponsorship, retail, stadium naming, partnerships, has now overtaken broadcast for 3 years running, reaching €5.3 billion, up from €4.9 billion the year before. Matchday revenue, the ticket and hospitality line people assume is the real football business, hit a record €2.4 billion, and it's still the smallest of the three. One side of the balance sheet, broadcast money, negotiated collectively by leagues, largely outside any single club's control. It's also unusually flat right now. The Big 5 European leagues have locked in domestic broadcast deals running through at least 2027, So most clubs aren't getting a fresh windfall from that line for several more years. The other side, commercial revenue, which clubs increasingly chase by turning the stadium into something closer to a year-round entertainment venue. Concerts, other sports, non-matchday events, anything that fills the building on the 340-plus days a year there isn't a match. That shift alone tells you something. The most reliable growth in football revenue right now isn't coming from football. It's coming from everything a stadium can be used for once the players go home. Now, the part that doesn't show up on a matchday program. Sponsorship as a vehicle for something other than sponsorship. When a shirt, a stadium, or a naming rights deal is signed with an entity connected to a sovereign wealth fund or a state-linked airline, the commercial logic usually isn't, will this sell more shirts? It's global visibility, soft power bought at a price that would make no sense for an ordinary retail sponsor, because the buyer isn't measuring return the way a retail sponsor would. UEFA's financial sustainability rules now specifically require fair value testing on related party sponsorship income for exactly this reason, because regulators know these deals can function as disguised investment rather than genuine commercial revenue. And then there's the mechanism almost nobody outside football finance understands, which is where a surprising share of profit actually comes from: player trading. Here's how it works. A club signs a young player for a relatively small transfer fee. Under accounting rules, that fee isn't expensed immediately, it's spread or amortized over the length of the player's contract. If the club develops that player and sells him 3 years later for several times the original fee, the difference between the amortized book value and the sale price shows up on the income statement as profit, a credit that comes not from broadcast, not from tickets, not from sponsorship, but from the appreciation of a human asset's registration rights. For a huge number of clubs below the very top tier, this profit on the disposal of players' registrations is the difference between reporting a loss and reporting a technical profit in any given year. Put the whole cash flow picture together and it looks like this. On one side, broadcast and sponsorship money flows in, some of it driven by football, a growing share of it driven by non-football stadium use, and by sponsors buying reach rather than product exposure. On the other side, wages, transfer amortization, and agent fees are already capped by regulation at up to 70% of revenue for clubs in Europe, before you even count interest on acquisition debt. And squeezed in between those two forces, player trading has become one of the few remaining levers a club actually controls to turn a technical profit, because everything else is either fixed by contract, capped by regulation, or negotiated collectively at league level. That's the machine. It was never built to reliably generate a profit from 90 minutes of football. It was built to generate cash flow large enough to service everything layered on top of it: the debt, the wage bill, the regulator, and, in some models, the dividend. Now the part where the machine actually breaks, because nothing shows you how a system really works better than watching it fail in public, in real time, with a deadline clock running. Bury Football Club, founded 1885, 2 FA Cups in its history. Not a giant, but a genuine, continuous, 134-year member of the English Football League, older than the Premier League itself, older than most of the companies now buying clubs like Bury's neighbors. In December 2018, owner Stephen Dale bought Bury for £1. £1. 5 months later, in the middle of a promotion push, he put the club up for sale again. That season, Bury won automatic promotion to League One, the third tier of English football. 3 months after that promotion, the club would no longer exist as an EFL member at all. Here's the timeline, and it moves faster than anyone expected. By July 2019, with debts mounting and creditors, staff, and players going unpaid, Dale proposed a company voluntary arrangement, a legal mechanism that lets an insolvent company negotiate a partial repayment plan with creditors instead of being wound up outright. Under EFL insolvency rules, proposing a CVA is automatically classified as an insolvency event, triggering a mandatory 12-point deduction on top of everything else going wrong. The CVA moratorium was enough to get a high court winding-up petition dismissed. Bury survived that particular week. But by early August, the club still hadn't played a single competitive fixture of the season. Every match had been postponed because of the club's financial state. On August 8, 2019, The EFL gave Barry 14 days. 14 days to present a credible plan to pay off its outstanding debts or face expulsion. For those 14 days, there was cautious optimism. Talk of a takeover. A buyer circling. On August 27, 2019, deadline day, the prospective buyer, CNN Sporting Risk, pulled out of the deal following due diligence. No other offer materialized before the 5 p.m. cutoff. That evening, the EFL board announced, in its own words, that it had unanimously determined with enormous regret that Barry's membership be withdrawn. Barry became the first club expelled from the English Football League in over 2 decades, since Maidstone United in 1992, and the first FA Cup winner in the competition's history to be forced out of it entirely. 134 years. 2 FA Cups. Gone in roughly 9 months, from a £1 sale to full expulsion. It didn't end there. In November 2020, Dale placed the by-then leagueless club into formal administration. Months earlier, in July 2020, the Football Association had already rejected Barry's application to rejoin the football pyramid at all, citing, specifically, its financial resources, ownership, and insolvency status. The 134-year-old institution wasn't just relegated. It was locked out of the entire system, at every level, because nobody could verify who was actually capable of paying its bills. Barry's fans didn't wait for administrators to decide their future. They formed a new club, Barry AFC, and were slotted into the 10th tier of English football, 10 divisions below where Barry FC had been playing less than 18 months earlier. And Barry wasn't an isolated glitch in the system. English football's lower divisions have a long, quiet history of clubs entering administration, being docked points, or disappearing entirely. Barry is simply the clearest, most recent, most completely documented example of the pattern running all the way to its worst possible outcome. Which is exactly why it's worth slowing down on. It shows, in real dates and real deadlines, what the rest of this episode has been describing in the abstract. Now put that timeline next to Manchester United's. United's owners loaded the club with hundreds of millions in acquisition debt. Watched that debt peak near £778 million, paid punishing interest on payment-in-kind loans, and still, in 2019, took over £90 million in dividends out of a club carrying that debt load. Nobody expelled Manchester United. Nobody forced a fire sale. The debt was, and still is, enormous by any normal business standard. But it never triggered a collapse, because the debt sat inside a structure with continuous, enormous broadcast and commercial cash flow, and owners with the resources and market access to refinance rather than default. Barry had none of that. A £1 purchase price, a single owner with no other balance sheet to draw on, no broadcast deal large enough to paper over a bad year, and a regulator whose insolvency rules are specifically designed to punish exactly the kind of financial fragility Barry had. The lesson isn't that small clubs are badly run and big clubs are well run. Manchester United's debt, in absolute terms, dwarfs anything Barry ever owed. The lesson is narrower and colder. The size of the debt was never the thing that determined survival. What determined survival was whether there was a backstop, a bank willing to refinance, an owner with other businesses, a sovereign fund that doesn't need this specific asset to cash flow on its own, standing behind the number when it came due. Which brings us to the actual reveal of this episode, and it isn't really about football at all. In a system where matchday revenue is capped by stadium size, broadcast revenue is negotiated collectively at league level, and wage spending is capped by regulation at up to 70% of revenue. The group that wins, consistently, is whoever owns the club as part of something bigger than the club. A sovereign wealth fund that pays £305 million for 80% of a club, watches that stake's implied value cross £1 billion within 3 years, and increases its holding to 85% along the way, wins regardless of where the team finishes in the table, because the fund isn't measuring return in trophies. It's measuring soft power and a rising asset valuation against a balance sheet worth roughly $1 trillion, where this single holding barely registers as risk. A leveraged financial owner who structured hundreds of millions in acquisition debt against the club's own future cash flow, and has since extracted tens of millions in dividends on top of interest payments. wins as long as the underlying broadcast and commercial cash flow keeps servicing the debt, because the downside was never really theirs. It belongs to the club's balance sheet. A multi-club network wins by definition, because no single club's bad season, relegation, or even outright collapse threatens the group. The portfolio absorbs it the way any diversified fund absorbs one bad position. A network holding stakes across 10 or more clubs on 5 continents doesn't need every club to work. It needs the network to work, on average, over time. While these owners spread the risk across a sovereign balance sheet, a leveraged capital structure, or a 10-club portfolio, a single local owner, the Stevendale model, the £1 purchase model, the owner with no other business and no other source of cash, is betting the entire 134-year existence of the institution on next season's gate receipts and next month's wage bill, with no fallback if either one comes up short. Same industry, same regulations, same 70% squad cost ceiling applying to everyone equally on paper. Completely different exposure to the exact same risk, depending entirely on what else the owner has standing behind them. And that's really the whole business model of modern football ownership. Once you strip away the badges and the anthems, it isn't a competition between football clubs anymore, at least not financially. It's a competition between balance sheets, sovereign, leveraged, or networked, with the football club itself sitting in the middle, absorbing the losses that the balance sheet behind it is willing to carry. The clubs with the deepest, most patient capital behind them can lose money for years and never feel it. The clubs without that capital lose money for a season or two and disappear. Go back to the image from the start of this episode. A stadium, sold out, 60,000 voices singing, and underneath it, a boardroom ledger with a hole in it that somebody has to fill every year. By now you know who usually fills it, and why they're usually fine with that. So next time you watch a full stadium on a Saturday, ask yourself 2 things. Is that revenue actually funding a football club, or is it funding somebody else's much bigger balance sheet, somewhere else entirely? And if the money standing behind your club disappeared tomorrow, is there anyone else who'd write the check? Or would it take 9 months to find out there isn't?